Welcome to the Divine Counsel Worldview podcast. We continue our study in the Gospel of John. Good to have you with us again, Mike. Today we're going to be handling John 1, verses 2 through 18. I can't stress enough, of course, the hope that you, the listener, have gone back and, shall we say, started with the beginning of this study, because a lot of what we're talking about is going to be settling in on things we've already decided or talked about or referred to. So I know how podcasts work. You can dip in and out of them, and that's good. But when it comes to John here, I'm finding that as I write things and prepare for these podcasts, my hope is that I'm saying to myself, well, I hope they heard the previous one, because what I'm about to say depends completely upon what I just said. So, well, Mike, let me give you an opening illustration, and I want to use it for venturing into John 1, especially verse 18, where it says monogones theos in Greek, and we have to work through that. That's to me, it's the opening shot across the bow when it comes to John's view of who Jesus is. So we're going to get there today, and let me give you an opening idea. I work at a bank, a major bank, where my day is spent. I'm a documentation guy, basically. I have a title like you do, but it has nothing to do with what I do. Sometimes my title is not descriptive of what I do. So if someone says, "What do you do?" I say, "Well, I work with documentation at a major bank," and by that I mean a person wants to change even, let's say, a word in a policy of this bank. Well, because of federal regulations and risk management departments and legal departments, the way to change even a word on a document at my bank is you have to submit it to me. I'm on the writing team, as it were. And then I promise a 21-day return time, basically, for you to change one word. Well, why so long? Because I take that change, well, here's my point, I guess, to start with. I get from the person the source document that he wants to change. He has to ask for that source document, which is what is already being used by the bank when it comes to a policy of something, okay? We send him that source document, and from that document, he works. And he or she will cross off a word or something, and that's all tracked in the document. They send it to me. I make sure it looks up to par in branding and things like that. Then I send it one by one for approvals to risk, federal and local government issues, legal sides of things, so forth and so on. And within the 21 days, usually, no problem, we can get that word changed. But notice how that story starts, and this is important. The document that I work from is called the source document. It's considered the truth, right? Now, again, we're working with stuff at a bank. So is it true or not? Well, for the sake of the argument, that's the point, that it is the abiding truth that we have to work with. It's a source document. The reason I start with that story is because here's my burden, and I'm going to, when we get to 118 today, the theme of this podcast is that Jesus is what I believe to be a unique deity, that the text literally says he is a unique deity. And when we talk like that, the question, of course, comes in to the modern Trinitarian mind. How can we call Jesus a unique deity? And here's my point, and then I would love to hear what you think about whether my illustration, or specifically where I'm going with this, that modern Trinitarianism, I don't mind modern Trinitarianism. I am a modern Trinitarianist. The problem, though, I have with modern Trinitarianism is that it considers Nicaea to be the source document. And we work from that, basically, God, fully God, things like that. Those phrases that we have allowed to be not just put into our hymns, but even our theology. And pick up any theology book, and it may use, and it often does, and I often highlight this, and I even write the word ouch next to it. Jesus is fully God. Well, what does that even mean? Fully God. It must there must be something so deeply rooted in the history of the word God that we can put a word fully in front of it, thinking that we're solving something, right? So here's my point, and then again, jump in. Modern Trinitarianism, in my opinion, uses Nicaea 325 AD as its source document for describing the relationship of Father, Son, and even Spirit. Well, let's just say Father, Son for now. And my point is, I don't think we need to do that. I think we can be loyal Trinitarianists. We can We can live up to the hope of what it means to be a good Trinitarian and not use Nicaea as a source document. We can instead, and here's my point today, use John 1:18, among other verses, to set out the shall we call it the source document from which all other conversations should proceed. Okay? Is that enough to jump in with, Mike?
I think so. I think I would nuance it as well, that modern Trinitarianism, there are a lot of different flavors. And I mean, to be honest, like, I don't think even modern Trinitarianism folks are actually really drawing from Nicaea, because they do push back on certain concepts like the eternal generation, or
yeah, true. That's right. Yeah.
Right, like there are some things that they have issues with, and so they try to modify it. And pretty much, like, when we come down to Trinitarian discussions, so many different also Christian camps use the Trinity as a way to analogize certain other doctrines or certain other theological stances that they take priority, right? Where there'll be Trinitarianism where there's like an extreme subordination.
Exactly. Yeah. So the role of men and women, for example, is often pulled in from the Trinitarian language. Well, could I say, though, that what you're saying is exactly my point, that people use the Nicene statement, shall we say, the generation issue, and they argue from that.
Yeah.
Now, I'm not, again, blaming anyone for that. I'm just saying, notice how we so easily are drawn to that statement and kind of start there. And so what I'm recommending today is, as we go through John 1 and we get to verse 18, that we let the text of John be our source document from which we work. And I think it'll be an interesting conversation on that level. So,
and if I could say, if anything, what we're also doing is simply, what I think, what our enterprise is doing is trying to actually reconstruct, in some sense, what the Nicene fathers like Athanasius were thinking of, what was in his mind, because he was a disciple of a disciple that was mentored by the apostles. And so you have already at least 2-3 generations of thought that's running that may not be as footnoted, but it's within the spirit of what he had been learning from folks that were closer to the original apostle teachings. And so I think the challenge is, how did the Nicene fathers reach to their summary statement of what became that creed? Yeah. Right? Because essentially that's what a creed is. It's a summary of deeply held beliefs that's been held for a long time unspokenly. Right. But then there was a need to actually codify it and write it down, because there was a threat to what was generally assumed, this is what we all hold, this is what we believe about who Jesus is. And so all of a sudden it became necessary to clarify it in written text.
Yep. Sounds like what I do at the bank.
Yeah.
We codify something. We finally put into practice what the department's been doing, shall we say.
Like these unspoken rules or unspoken assumptions that now need to be clarified because there was confusion that's happening.
Fair enough. Yeah. Well, let's jump in. John 1, we're going to start in verse 2 today and get up to verse 18. He was in the beginning with God, and that in the beginning with God, again, referring back to 1, I take to mean that Jesus is eternal. He is pre-existent, and again, there's a lot going on here that we could get into the weeds, but I'm just going to give you my opinion, that he was in the beginning with, and in Greek, it is the theos, or the theon, ton theon. So probably has reference then to Yahweh there. He's in the beginning with the God of the Old Testament. So it's asking us, a fascinating idea, right? That go back and reread Genesis 1. Have Jesus there with Yahweh, with the God. And then, of course, all things were made through him. We'll get to that in verse 10, so let me hang on to that. All things being made through Jesus in just a moment. Without him was not anything made that was made. Again, amazing idea. In him was life, verse 4, and life was the light of men, and the light shines in the darkness, and the darkness did not comprehend it. I know we could get into a lot of ideas there, but for sake of a DCW conversation, I have nothing to add that a good commentary would not do for us, if you don't mind. So stop me if you want, Mike, but I'm going to keep reading, okay?
Well, I do find it's interesting. So are you reading from the New King James Version?
I have New King James in front of me here, yeah.
So another translation choice for the darkness has not comprehended it was the darkness has not overcome it.
Overcome it. Okay. Yeah, that'd be, well, there you go. That is a DCW issue. Fair enough.
Because it's coming from Catalambano, and it has various meanings in the BDAG, the dictionary for Greek New Testament. It can mean win, attain, catch up with, seize, catch, understand, or grasp. And so I think what's interesting is that the translation team in the ESV, they understood the darkness as being an actually ominous force. And so the darkness has not overcome it. They went with that sense of the Greek to indicate.
You could almost capitalize the D on darkness there.
Almost,
personalize it. Yeah.
Yeah, it's like a story like this. This is that he opposed it and he actually overcame something that I think maybe some other translation teams might just have thought as more metaphysical. And this became like, no, like he overcame actual like opposition and force.
Yeah, beautiful idea. That again, we could dive into even deeper, no doubt about it. But let's move on. Thank you. There was a man sent from God. Verse 6 gets into the narrative of John the Baptist, whose name was John. Again, we could go into the story of John, but because he's in all four Gospels, he seems to be a extremely important person to the story of Jesus and the introduction of Jesus to the world. Of course, the Father sending his Son, but he uses John as the messenger to warn the world, to warn and invite the world to see him. This man came for a witness, to bear witness of the light, that all through him might believe. There's our word pistos. We'll talk a lot about that in the book of John. Pistis, believe, become loyal to. He was not that light, but was sent to bear witness of that light. That was the true light, which gives light to every man who comes into the world. So again, for time, I'm not going to deal with anything there. Is there anything in those verses that catches your attention, Mike?
No, I think we're good. We took a moment just to see about the overcoming the darkness moment. That was a pretty cool moment.
Yeah, let's get on to verse 10. He was in the world. Now here we get that idea again of being a co-creator of some kind. And so let's look at that quickly. This to me is a DCW issue. Verse 10, he was in the world, and the world was made. Now this is ESV. The world was made through him, yet the world did not know him. Verse 11, he came to his own, and his own people did not receive him. That through him, all things were made, or the world was made through him. The Greek preposition dia is there, through him. What's interesting is if you look at that idea of Yahweh creating, or the God of the Old Testament, again, we may differ. In fact, let's get that off maybe in front of the conversation right now. When I say Yahweh, I mean the God of the Old Testament. You may think of Yahweh as a different meaning behind it, or how did I catch that last time?
Well, I guess like for me, like the name Yahweh is synonymous with creator, right? And so it's his personal name, but it refers to the creator. And so that's why with my mindset, Yahweh can be applied to Jesus because he is also creator.
Got it. Right? Okay. So just so you know, for the listener, when I say Yahweh, I'm thinking the God of the Old Testament. When Mike says Yahweh, he may include the creatorship idea to which Jesus can join into that name. Is that how I'm saying it?
Yeah.
Okay. Now, what's interesting is Colossians 1 and Hebrews 2 also have this concept of Jesus being, shall we say, a co-creator. For by him, that is Jesus. This is Colossians 1:16. Now here we have the preposition en, auto. For by him all things were created. All things were created dia, through him, and for him. Ace is the preposition there. So all I'm trying to say is that we probably can't, as much as we would like to, argue prepositions when it comes to the relationship of Jesus and the creation. Did Jesus create, or did God create the world through dia, through him? I think the Bible will be general enough on that we probably can't argue the issue of which preposition to use. In fact, Hebrews 1:2, Jesus is appointed heir of all things, through whom, there's the dia preposition again, through whom he, that's God, created the world. So all to say, and I'm willing to let it go for conversation, is in some sense, the book of John begins by saying in various ways that when you think of the creation of Genesis 1, you must include Jesus with him in some sense, creating along with him, through him, for him, by him, something like that. So, okay. I'm ready for verse 12. But as many as receive, but again, ESV, but to all who did receive him, who believed in his name, he gave the right to become children of God. And the one thing that I like to jump on in that verse, because again, this is so elemental to the bigger story, so we could dive in various ways. But what I'd like to do here is look at that word receive, elabon from lambano. It's maybe my past that I'm reacting against, but the idea that to become a Christian is a very passive experience in my background, that I would receive a gift, that I would passively accept his imputed righteousness to my account. Those kind of theological phrases are thrown out so quickly that it's easy. And I grew up again with invitations being given at the end of most services, right? And so as a person is invited to come down or forward, they are invited to receive the gift that is offered to them. And that kind of language is elevated or even honored, I guess, by John 1:12, but all who did receive him. And all I want to say coming out of that verse is be careful, because the word lambano, as you look at it throughout the Greek text, it often is more than just taking a gift. It is to receive it with intention of using it. So John 12:48, the one who rejects me and does not lambano my words. Well, receive might mean passively accept. No, it means to hear them and receive them in a sense of proactively doing something about them. John 13:20, truly whoever receives the one I send receives me, lambano. Whoever receives me receives the one who sent me. Very active. And I guess my point being, be careful that we don't make salvation a passive issue because of the word receive in English. The Greek word lambano, like in John 19:1, can be very aggressive. Then Pilate took Jesus, lambano Jesus, and flogged him. So again, coming out of my background, I'm pushing against memories of making salvation very passive. And I think we need, my personal opinion, Mike, is that salvation is one of the most aggressive things the human can do in receiving the gospel, receiving Jesus. You could veritably say, take him. I'm taking Jesus. And that would be an interesting way of inviting people to come forward and take Jesus, right? So
I think, and I think I've mentioned this with you before on the podcast, because my doctoral degree that I'm doing right now, in the first year during the cohort, one of the books I was reading, the research about like preaching and kind of the development of theology that was going on within evangelicalism, this mentality that you're talking about of like almost passively receiving, or in other ways describing it would be a mental assent, right? Where you mentally agree. Do you believe? Do you agree with these facts? That kind of theological thrust and sort of altar call-ish way of describing things, that has been more of the last 50 years. Yeah. That was more of a prominent theology that crept into evangelicalism really more in the last 50 so years, because in some sense there was this drive to make it seem that salvation or becoming a Christian was very easy, or there were very few obstacles in the way. Mm-hmm. And yet what you're talking about here, even from just the Greek like New Testament dictionaries, the very first definition is to get hold of something by laying hands or grasping. And so I think sometimes the way that we've preached the gospel at times, and for those to receive Jesus, is as though Jesus or salvation lands in your lap, versus in this sense, this is actually you will have to actually hold this with your hands. You have to be actually conscientious of what you're doing. You're actually holding onto it. You're not going to let it slip through your hands.
Nicely done. Yeah. Good. Thank you. We can finish the verse, which he's even heightening your point, who believed in his name, who lambano Jesus, who believe, and again, I would recommend, we're going to get to this, that pistuo there would be a loyalty issue, who become loyal to the name of Jesus. He gave the right to become children of God. Again, something we'll be talking about as we go, a very DCW-ish idea that human beings who are created in the image of Elohim, yet in the story of Scripture, can become children of Elohim, or theos, a tekna theou is the term in Greek there. That, and it's not common. There's the idea of sons of God or a son of God is a whole discussion unto itself. But children of God is only 2 times in the Gospels, and it's only in John 1:12 and John 11:52. It is used in Paul, tekna theou, the child of God idea. That's in Romans 8:16, 17, 21. And it's a very family-oriented issue there in Paul's argument, and I think it's coming from the general context of Romans, where you're in a villa in Rome talking about what it means to be a Christian, and that concept of, well, you have to join the family of Abraham and thus become part of a family, core concept is very much in Romans. And so I think the children of God here, as much as could be said, is inviting us to think very broadly at this point about joining the family, the larger family of God, and thus become an inheritor of all the privileges that family has. Outside of just the Jewish model, of course, it would be the entire family. So John, or whoever wrote First John, whether it be the same author as the book of John, he does use this idea to become, the opposite of a child of God in his mind, 1 John 3:10, is a child of the devil. So it's a powerfully fascinating idea, and it really does have family overtones to it. And for time, we'll move on. But
can I mention something that's interesting?
Anything you want to mention on that?
So I think, with teknon, right? For those who haven't taken Greek before, this word is interesting because it's actually a neuter gender word. So it can apply male or female, and you can specify a male child or male children or female children based on adjectives that you would use along with it to help, kind of flesh it out. But this does seem to also touch upon, Greco and particularly Roman culture when it came down to adoption. That the adoption mentality of the Romans was that you would be adopted into my family. If I was a guy with a wife who didn't have children and we wanted to adopt another person's child, maybe because the person is an orphan or bad family situation, whatever, once we adopt that person into our family, in Roman law, that person's given the full privileges and legal rights of my family. And so it's a very interesting concept, because then children of God doesn't necessarily mean you have to been born or genetically related, right? And even children of the devil doesn't mean you have to be born or genetically related. It's you're adopted in, you're brought into the family. So now you're part of this big umbrella and you have all the legal rights and protections of that family.
Right. And here comes the whole argument of the New Testament, I would say, or the fuel that fans the flames of almost every page of New Testament discussion is what comprises the family. It started as a Jewish man and his wife, but now what is it? Especially since Jesus has come. So well said. On to 114. Let me go to 114. Again, moving along, getting up to 18 this time. The Word became flesh and dwelt among us. And again, there's so much that my mind runs to, and maybe that's what the author's trying to do. He's just trying to make the crowd listening to this go, hang on a second. That's an amazing idea, that a pre-existent, eternal deity with the Father, unlike the Father, came down here, became flesh and dwelt among us. Very physical terms. Of course, he's not embarrassed by this. And in that world, there was that Platonic embarrassment that being fleshly was considered evil by some sects within Roman thinking or Greek thinking. And what you have right off the bat in the book of John is that this God, this Jesus, can come to earth, take on human flesh, and it's okay. It's good, in fact. Became flesh and dwelt among us. And then as it ends, we have seen his glory, glory as of the only Son from the Father. Now there we get into that use of that word monogenes. Only Son is the ESV spin on that. Monogenes. And it doesn't have the word son in Greek, but the ESV has decided to go with that as its translation. Let's talk about monogenes. This is a word that Mike, I know, Dr. Heiser worked with in his podcast because it's a DCW issue, I would say, as to how to define this term. This is from a about 20-some-year-old article. Monogenes is from Gerard Pendrick is who I'm quoting from here. Let me give you a quote and listen to how he handles monogenes. Monogenes is formed from the adjective stem mono and the noun stem genos. From genos, a noun which ranges in meaning from race or kin to type or kind. And so by etymology, monogenes means only one of its kind or kin. In other words, unique. Comparable to monogenes in sense are such adjectives as homogenes, of the same kind, heterogenes, of a different kind. Since genos is itself connected etymologically with the verb gignomai, and so with the notion of birth, monogenes could be, and occasionally was, interpreted as only born. And that is the older understanding. Again, if you go back 20, 30 years, 50, 60 years in biblical commentaries, you'll see monogenes, our old John 3:16 verse, right? The only begotten Son of God. That's a term that is historically in English associated with monogenes. And Pendrick's point, as I continue to read a little bit more, is that that's not really accurate. So let me keep going. Galen, for example, this is a Roman writer, characterizes the liver as a monogenes organ. Theophrastus, again a Greek historian, described the beech or the yew and the alder trees as monogenes, that is, the only ones of their kind, in contrast to the elm, of which there were two genae, or two species. Eusebius, again a church father who comes after Jesus, uses monogenes of an enormous church built by Constantine in Antioch. These and other passages show that Christian authors, here's the point, could employ monogenes in the sense of unique without any hint of the idea of birth or derivation. And I think, and I know that's where Mike wanted to go with it, and that's certainly where I think the text is personally, this is my view as well, that when we have in Greek, he's the monogenous para patros. He's the unique, here's what I think it's saying. This one who has come down and dwelt among us in the flesh. We see his glory. Well, what kind of glory did this 6-foot person have that we would say, whoa? Well, here's what, and again, I don't think he shone or he levitated above the ground, but why was he glory-ish? I think the text is simply saying he was the unique one from the Father. He's unique from the Father. Whatever you think. Now, here's where the DCW to me, and then I'll get your opinion, Mike. Here's where the DCW issue comes home for me. In the Old Testament, we have numerous examples of agents of God coming to earth. Shall we say angeloi or malachim, angels we call them, gods who come to earth and things like that. And we've often wondered which ones, if any, could be Jesus in pre-incarnate form. That's a good question. It's an open question. I like to talk about it. Whatever you do with that in the Old Testament, what John wants you to do, when you turn the page to John 1, he wants you to think, now that you've seen Jesus, this is unique. Whoever he is unique. He's not another one of the same kind. Mm-hmm. He is somebody very different. And even the word very there is not, I learned this early in my language, just writing, that I had a teacher cross off the word very once when I put it in front of the word unique. You can't be very unique. You're either unique or you're not, right? And so it's not an adjective that can take another adjective in front of it. And so, long story short, Jesus is unique. And I think John wants to get that in our head right off the bat, because what he's going to do with this person of Jesus is going to be so fascinating. So anyway, thoughts?
I agree with you about monogenes. I remember Dr. Heiser had done an episode where he just talked only about that one word. And that the older understanding, sometimes there's pushback I think originally because the older understanding was this desire to make sure that we didn't cross into a sort of paganism, where that instead of like noticing of the unique one of a kindness, the maybe even genre or race that Jesus is from, he is unique. He is not like any other. Then, anyways, I agree with you on that. I think there is another verb here that also kind of, I think John is hinting because he's drawing back from an idea that's also found in the Greek Old Testament translation. And it's the word in the ESV, it's translated as dwelt. And it's as skino. And it's used 4 times in the Septuagint version of the Old Testament. And it's used to talk about the moment when the presence, the Shekinah glory of God, the cloud of God would dwell in the tabernacle tent. And so, like, I've heard, other people who've done their own personal translations where they would say, and the word became flesh and pitched his tent among us.
Or essentially, tabernacled. I've heard that term too.
Yeah, or tabernacled with us to draw back to that idea of Yahweh who dwelt with his people in the midst of the wilderness, that he was actually living and he had his own tent while they also had their own tents, and that he had his own tent as he went along with them through the wilderness. And so it's an interesting callback that this word is unique. He's dwelling with us. Like, what are you alluding to, John? Like, why are you using that particular word and using this phrasing to talk about this word?
And thank you. And I think what we can do, and I could, because I think ahead about what we're going to be talking about in John 1. We can do it now. Go up to John 1:51. It's not part of today's conversation, but it's coming. John 1:51. He said to him, "Most assuredly, I say to you," Jesus talking, "hereafter you shall see the heavens open and the angeloi of God ascending and descending upon the Son of Man." And I think that is hearkening back, of course, to Genesis 28, Jacob's vision of a ladder up and down with divine beings traveling. It's almost as though Jesus, this is my opinion again, is trying to say, I'm this portable portal. I am the kind of person that you're going to see amazing things come from the heavens, as it were, down to me and me back up to him, the Father, because of of course, who I am. I'm unique. And also what I represent to the world. I am a portal of divine thought that's far beyond anything I think any human has seen yet. So,
I mean, and also, like, wouldn't it be fair to say, right? Because people will, some folks will push back on the importance of what theology terms will call this the incarnation, the fact that God born as a human being, and why is that such a big deal? What we saw in the Old Testament were just these instances, right, where an agent would appear, seems to have some physicality, can grab people, grab Lot and drag him out of the city, that kind of thing. And yet what we have here being described by John is who appears to be a divine being who actually willingly became a human being and lived and went through the whole process of living as a human being. Right? Going through 9 months of gestation in his mother's womb, going through the whole entire experience of childhood and even worse, puberty, and like experiencing all those things that we would just think, why can't you just skip that?
Exactly. Yeah. Well, that's boy, you rub me on a certain one there. When I think of how salvation has often been described, you run right to what they call the finished work of Christ, and you just skip the whole thing, as though if you can get to Gethsemane, now you have salvation offered you. And I'd recommend, as you're saying, the story of John will be, wait a second, he tabernacled here for 30 years, and that's important to the story. So.
I just remember the moment in a youth retreat camp where the preacher, the guy that spoke at our youth retreat, just reminded us, well, Jesus is human. That meant he had body odor. That meant that he went through puberty, and we're all like teenagers at that time. We're just like, holy cow. It was just like, he was really a human being. And like, how do you take that? Like, because we naturally just are taught that our bodies are disgusting almost in some Christian camps, right? Like, oh, we have to, discipline our bodies, and absolutely true. But at the same time, he wasn't disgusted by it. Like, apparently this divine being, this word, was not repulsed of being a full-on human being.
Right. Which is against Gnostic heresy of that time period. So maybe there is something here where John, writing in 80, 90 AD or somewhere in that time frame, is my guess, is that he is putting a little, turning the dagger on the idea of, or putting a dagger into the idea of Gnosticism, that the world is icky, the world is fleshly, thus evil. And John is trying to recommend Jesus became this, and he wasn't offended by it. So, by the way, the word unique one, or monogones, appears 4 times in Johannine literature, 3 in John and 1 in 1 John. This is the only time it doesn't have a supporting noun behind it. Other times it's coming up in 118, where we're going to land today, is monogones theos. 3 other times it's monogones huios, monogones son, unique son. John 3:16, John 3:18, and 1 John 4:9. So this one is one of 5 places in the New Testament where Jesus is called monogenes. I'm ready to move on to verse 17. Again, this may not be a DCW issue, but I like to give you my opinion because it works for me. So this is the kind of thing where I throw it out there and say, folks, here's where I am, and Mike, here's where I am, but I don't think I can mandate it, clearly. I think I'm right, but I might be wrong, as they say. For the law was given through Moses. Fair enough. We know that story. Again, John is writing to people who basically, I think, know the Old Testament story. The law, Torah came through Moses. The agent that God used in that time period was Moses. However, grace and truth came through Jesus Christ. Now, what I don't think that means is, hey, for the first time, you're seeing graciousness, or the first time you're seeing truth, because we know the Old Testament, God, Exodus 34, he claims to be gracious. So the whole point is that graciousness and truthfulness did not start with Jesus, even though that's how the verse could be taken or mistaken. Here's what I think is happening, and I'm being helped in my mind by Romans 15, verses 8 and 9. Where Paul says, again, to a Roman church of people who are trying to figure out who Jesus is, right? I again, said in front of people who may have accepted him and some who may not have. Here's how it goes. Christ became a servant to the circumcised, that is the Jew, to show God's truthfulness. And that word emet in Hebrew, or aletheia in Greek, often has the idea of promise keeping. He is a God who holds to his promises, which is a unique idea among the divine world. So again, Christ became a servant to the Jew to show God's truthfulness in keeping a promise that he had coming out of the Old Testament. In fact, he even says it, in order to confirm the promises given to the patriarchs. And how else does Jesus become a servant? In order that the Gentiles, it's the non-Jew, might glorify God for his mercy. Now again, Jews glorify God for his mercy, but why would a Gentile, in Paul's mind, looking across the audience there in that Roman villa where this book is being read, why would a Gentile think immediately of God's mercy and grace? Because, here's my opinion, they were outside the law for so long. They were looking in from the outside. Their noses were up against the glass, and if a Cornelius, for example, wants to become part of the family of God, he's got to be circumcised according to Jewish tradition. And what Jesus will do, and here's John. To me, this is, again, so much coming into the Samaritan woman story and beyond. What Jesus will introduce for the first time, and this is a first time, that you can become part of the Jewish family without joining Jewish tradition. It sounds minor to us. It wasn't minor to them. And that's what I think this verse is saying. Torah comes through Moses. But if you want to see graciousness and truth, graciousness to the Gentile, truth to the Jew, that's Jesus. So that's my spin on that. Any thoughts?
I was trying. I agree with you on that way, and that's a good use of Romans 15. What I was trying to find, can't find it right now. I know it's in Exodus. It's one of the interactions between Moses and Yahweh, and I think it was probably after the golden calf incident, and it was the moment when God was coming before Moses, and his sort of descriptor is that he is the God of truth and grace, or truth and mercy. That
34:6 is where you're
what
thinking.
John is referring to is, the law came through Moses, but we're talking about even who's the giver of the law. He's the one that is who is full of mercy and full of grace.
Exodus 34:6 is where I think you're thinking of.
34:6.
Yahweh, the Yahweh Elohim, is merciful, gracious, long-suffering, and abounding in goodness and truth. Yeah.
And so like you have, again, even that callback to that moment, and it's the Lord, Yahweh, merciful and gracious. It's just an interesting thing, right? It's like, don't just focus on the law. Yeah, that came from Moses, but who was the one that gave Moses the law, and that Moses was actually interacting with? Well, that's the God of graciousness, the God of truth.
Fair enough. Let's get to 118. Thank you. And here's where I intended to park most of our time because, again, of what is being said. It's a fascinating statement that has caused us to wonder, what in the world? How do we handle this? For no one, here it is, no one has ever seen God. I think what he's saying there is, remember our history, our story as human beings. When it comes to the God, or Yahweh, or the God of the Old Testament, the one who created everything, he is by definition, this is in Deuteronomy 4, and Moses saw no form. 1 Timothy is at 6, God invisible. That the idea of Yahweh is that he does not have a body from which or off which protons bounce into my retina. I cannot visualize the way a human visualizes things is by light, right? Photons. And so I don't think he's trying to get scientific here, but he's just saying, our story, that our God is not visible to human sight. Fair enough. Okay. So he's ready then to move on. By the way, this is also in 1 John 4:12. The same writer, or again, the book of 1 John, uses the same idea with a different verb, to see, but you cannot see him. 1 John 4:12 uses that same idea. All right, here it comes. Now in go ahead.
I am curious, like, because when I hear the phrase, no one has ever seen God, my mind also goes back to that same incident of being on the mountain as God is talking with Moses, the presence and everything. Yep. And Moses requests, well, I want to see your glory. I want to see your glory. God's response is, no, you can't see my face, because no man can see me without basically dying.
Have we talked about what's going on there? I mean,
I don't think so. I don't think we've ever talked.
Can I give you my opinion? And then I want you to hear your opinion too, because this is, obviously when it says no man's seen God, well, what about Exodus 24? Okay. Mm-hmm. So here it is. It's Exodus 24, verse 2. Moses alone shall come near Yahweh, but they shall not come near. So Moses and Aaron, Nadab and Abihu and 70 elders are going up on Sinai, 24:2 of Exodus. And God says, now, Moses alone will come near Yahweh. The other ones won't. So however we look at this story, it is different for what Moses is going to experience as compared to the other people. Verse 3, so Moses came and told the people all the words. I'm not going to read that. Moses, Get down to verse 9. Then Moses went up, and also Aaron, Nadab, and Abihu, and the 70 of the elders of Israel. It's like 74 people go up. And they saw the Elohim of Israel. So 74 people saw the Elohim of Israel. I don't think that's Yahweh. I think that's the Elohim of Israel. And there was under his feet, they're talking to someone. They're having potluck with somebody. Under his feet, as it were, a paved work of sapphire stone. It was like the very heavens in its clarity. But on the nobles of the children of Israel, the 70 elders, this Elohim of Israel, did not lay his hand. And I take it to be a physical hand. So they saw Elohim, and they ate and drank. Again, notice it doesn't say Yahweh, and I think it's being carefully, in other words, they purposely, the writer is not putting Yahweh there because of who we have. Then Yahweh, verse 12, said to Moses, come up to me. So I see two Elohim in this story. One is a physical one who they're having potluck with, and then there's Yahweh above that. Yahweh says to Moses in verse 12, "Come up to me on the mountain and be there, and I will give you tablets of stone and the law of commandments which I have written that you may teach them." So Moses arose with his assistant Joshua, and Moses went up the mountain of God. Verse 16, the glory of Yahweh rested on Mount Sinai. And so anyway, that's what I take to be this being. And by the way, that being who is the Elohim of Israel, verse 10, I have a line in my Bible back to the previous chapter, 23, verse 20. "Behold, I send a malach before you. Beware of him, obey his voice. My name is in him." So whoever we want that person to be or think he is, some people could make it Jesus. That's fine. It doesn't have to be. In other words, you can have a DCW and not have to have Jesus there. You can have an Elohim of Israel. You can have someone like a Gabriel, a Michael, somebody who is being given the agency of being in charge of this moment. Like kings will send out, people who are ruler. The idea of sending out a prince to do the work of a king, I think, is just always in the mind of the Israelite here. So the idea of, long story short, 24:10, they saw the God of Israel. I take it to be the Malach of chapter 23. So
I would agree with you. I think where I would differ is, well, one, let's just for sake, because you and I can read the Hebrew. It is Elohim, but some folks may instantly wonder, why can't that be seen as they saw the gods of Israel? And
okay.
And the reason is because of that very key word that's also in the translation. There was under his
right.
feet.
It's singular.
So singular.
Yeah.
So it's a singular Elohim. It's a singular divine being at that moment who's given this interesting kind of description, the Elohim of Israel. And I do agree with you. I think this Elohim of Israel is connected to the Malach that was sent.
Yeah.
Where I would probably differ is that because I do see Yahweh as more as the name of the creator. This to me it's a two powers issue going on.
Okay.
Right. And so it would be confusing for the writers, the compilers of Exodus to put, and they saw Yahweh. And then later Yahweh speaks to Moses saying, "Come up here," as though, there's a distance factor going on. And so then
right.
there's very easy at that moment. You can all of a sudden have a moment of, what is that term? It's basically, like just taking off one mask and putting on another mask, versus you actually have two separate persons that we're dealing with in the set of verses.
Yeah.
And yet they're both identified ultimately with Israel.
Yeah.
So we're the two powers issue, I think, is going on in these set of verses.
That's fair. Yeah. Thank you. So all to say, back to John 1:18, no one has ever seen God. We can still have Genesis 24 in play. We can still have Exodus 24 in play. We can also have Exodus 33 in play, where later Moses wants to see Yahweh, and Yahweh says, "You can't see me and live." So
yeah,
he doesn't see his panim, his face. He sees his glory or his backside. So there's some kind of story going on there where God is trying to teach a human being that if you actually did allow photons to hit your retina bouncing off me, you may not live through that experience. It's a bizarre idea, but it's very real to the writer and to the reader of that world. Mm-hmm. All right, so 118, no one has seen God any time. That's the basic point. But here's again why Jesus makes so much difference to the story. And in Greek, monogones theos is the likely reading. There is a textual problem, and I want to admit to that. So no one has seen God any time. The monogones theos, who was at the Father's side, if we were following the ESV, he has made him known. Let's talk about that monogenes theos term. I'm often asked, as you are, Mike, what Bible is the best one to use? I would just say, as Dr. Heiser would say, well, whichever one you want to read, frankly, in English, because where we want to say, what Bible do you use? It's a mistake, because we want to always use the source text. Here we go to that source document concept. It's the Greek and Hebrew, right? That's the source document. So whatever Bible you have in your briefcase or your backpack at the time, that's the one I would use. I remember when I'm asked that question, I'm always thinking of my fellow PhD student at Dallas Seminary. We kind of went through together, same time period. We were friends before we got there. And so a lot of our time to study something, we'd get together at the library or something. And he pulled out his Bible. I'd pull out mine. He happened to have an NIV. I happened to have a new KJV. Why? Because we just brought that to seminary with us. We just had it in our briefcase at the time, and that became our Bible that we used. Now, but if you had asked him, what Bible do you use? He wouldn't even think of NIV. That's not why he has it. He thinks in Hebrew and Greek. But that's the point, that when we think in terms of what is the source document for John 1:18, you cannot think ESV. You cannot think New KJV. You have to think the Greek text. And here it becomes a problem because, frankly, and here's where Bible Gateway is a helpful online source where you can ask it to just list every 30 some versions that it's handling at all times, and ask it for all 30 versions of a verse. And when it comes to John 1:18, it's good to look because, for example, again, the New King James, the Old King James, no man hath seen God at any time, the only begotten Son, who is in the bosom of the Father. For some reason that has Son. Most English versions do read with some kind of phrase, the only Son, only begotten Son, something like that. That's because of a Greek textual issue where some texts do have the word huios there instead of theos. There are a few versions, the ESV is one of them, that goes with only begotten or only son, God, G-O-D, capital G-O-D. And when it comes to then, here's where I'm going to argue we have to think Greek and not English. And by the way, let me just say again, for the textual issue between son or huios and theos, God, it's available in any kind of apparatus of a Greek Testament. Mm-hmm. The general argument is, or the general actual situation is that monogones theos, translatable as only begotten God, is in generally the older texts, the papyri, things like that. Yep. And that monogones huios is certainly in the majority of texts, but they're later. And so here is how Philip Miller would say it. This is in a book called Revisiting the Corruption of the New Testament. That's based on a text or a book that Bart Ehrman had written. Here's how he would say it. Scholars have long debated the textual evidence for whether the reading of 1:18 should be monogones theos, which can be translated as the unique God, or ha monogones huios, the unique Son. Most textual critics are swayed by the strength of the external evidence in favor of monogones theos. And by external, he means look at the texts themselves and look at their age, their date, their provenance, things like that. He goes on to say, copyists tended to transcribe toward authors' styles. Think now in terms of internal evidence as well. Thus, monogones theos is a harder reading. I mean, it's the only time in the Bible that you have it. Monogones theos. It's the harder reading and thus generally to be preferred since this phrase occurs nowhere else. In contrast, it's difficult to see why a scribe would change monogones huios, which is used 4 other times in Johannine literature, or 3 other times, to monogones theos. So for various reasons, and again, this is another discussion for another day and time, the textual discussion of is it monogones huios or monogones theos, most land on the side of monogones theos, which causes the problem though, right? Because now we have a phrase in Greek that's often translated as unique God. And Trinitarians don't like to talk about unique gods, right? Or that's generally, since Aquinas, we only have one anyway. So why would you have a unique one, right?
Yeah, which is partly why then the theology becomes hard because in the theological mental space, other deities or gods, like somehow, some reason, spiritual beings like angels or what they would call angels are not considered spiritual enough to be called a god.
Right.
It's an interesting kind of way of how the definitions had changed over time, that then there was no flexibility or remembrance that the term itself had the flexibility.
Yep.
And so this really shouldn't be causing an issue.
It isn't. And here's my point that I think, again, if someone's been listening to this podcast for a while, they know where I'm going. I think they can predict this. What you do is you cross off the word God in your Bible and say to yourself, there are no capital Gods in the Bible. That's an English theological spin on the word Elohim or theos, depending on which testament I'm in. There is no capital G on God. Now, there never was one. So if I take that out and I say there, so I would read it this way. No one has ever seen theos, which we know that to be the creator God. The unique theos, we're talking about Jesus, not God, but theos, the unique theos, who is in the bosom of the Father. He has made him known. As a DCW person who believes in plural theoi going in, I have no problem with that. In other words, it would not stun me to think that I've got numerous theoi in the heavens, one of which is Yahweh, the creator, another of which is Jesus. See where I'm going? That As long as I have plural theoi in my head going into this verse, now when I'm told that there's a unique one, I'm not bothered by it. But if I back up, and here's my problem with Nicene Trinitarianism, we capitalize a G on God and say Jesus is fully God. I have no idea what that means. Fully God. Are you trying to say he's more theos than someone else? Remember, Satan's going to be called a theos in 2 Corinthians 4. So the idea of Jesus being a unique God makes no sense. I understand that. But it doesn't bother me to hear Jesus being called a unique theos.
I mean, and I understand what your frustration about them using the term fully God. I mean, to me, Nicaea was also, it's partly a polemic, right? It's right. Polemical in the sense that they are also really exerting, we want to emphasize this slant of our particular theology camp. And they're trying to emphasize very strongly their belief that Jesus, against Arian and his other followers, he isn't subordinate. He isn't a like 90% deity type of thing. Like they were trying to really say, no, he's creator, and let's go at that. I get why we've had these discussions before. I understand why you're frustrated. I also do see it though from their angle of we're trying to really make clear with the modern question as it is in their time when it was modern to Jesus is fully God, meaning he isn't an angel. He isn't something lesser. He is so different. You can't just treat him as though he is just another one of these creations.
Yeah, and that brings us back to John 1:18. Is that fair? That no one has ever seen God, but the unique deity, that's how I translate it now, the unique deity, Jesus is a unique deity. How so? And he goes on to say, who's in the Father's side, at the Father's side in Greek, the kalpon, the kalpos of the Father, which is clearly pulling out a symbolic meaning to something that I don't think he has words for. So like in Luke 6:38, good measure pressed down will be put into your kalpos, your lap. It's a very intimate part of your being. So like in John 13:23, one of his disciples whom Jesus loved was reclining at table at Jesus' kalpos, his lap, his chest, his let's just leave it there, his chest. So the story in John 1:18, he's trying to think, how do I describe this? Here's what I think he's going through, the mental gymnastics of saying, how do I tell people who Jesus is? Well, you don't see God, you don't see Yahweh, but here's what you do see. A unique deity who veritably comes at or out of the Father's lap. Wow. Again, I don't think that's literal. It can't be because he doesn't have a lap from which to come, but the picture of intimacy is clearly there. He has made him known. So,
well, Ron, isn't this like this is part of the challenge, right? Of what the Old and even here, John, the New Testament writers are trying to describe a God who has no physicality, but then using terms, because we're human, we understand things from a physical, from metaphorical and physical kind of terminology. And so, like, remember the last time, I think, when we were talking about this, of like, if you had like some sort of description of Yahweh, what would you see? And you and I got into discussion about like I imagined like a cloud, and if you could somehow peer inside the cloud, you brought up the idea of like, would then I see a cloud within the cloud?
Uh-huh. Yeah.
And so, like, in some sense, I'm seeing this where John is trying to describe this Jesus, the monogones, theos, who is at the Father's side. It's like it in our way of describing it is also like a fold, like as though like a fold of a garment. Yeah. And so it's just like, oh, he's revealing what was within the God, within the Father's side. And
maybe this is where we get the eternal generation discussion in Nicaea, that the Son is eternally generated by the Father. He's not created by the Father, but he's generated. And to me, that distinction between generate or create is beyond what the Greek needs to go. And I would say just go with John 1:18. It's a beautiful symbol picture of, here's how I translate it thus. No one has ever seen Yahweh. Jesus is the unique deity who is intimate with the Father, making Yahweh known. And however, again, we want to parse the word Yahweh there. This is my spin on it, that you've got the God of the Old Testament who has never been seen, and now we have a unique deity who veritably comes out of the Father's chest into the world. And as though he's saying, are you ready to hear this story about this person, and what he brings to the world? So,
yeah, it goes. I think part of the difficulty is we are so locked to time that we inevitably always think of there has to be some sort of like progression, and the eternal generation concept is really just the Nicene Fathers were trying to describe something of like, how do you describe steps within eternity?
Yeah,
how do you describe progression within a timeless being, a being who is essentially timeless? Time was created by him.
Which is interesting to think that Jesus is not younger than Yahweh. They are both the same age. He's the Son, he's the sent one. I would even argue he's the subordinate one, but he is eternally with him, and he's never been younger or never started existing. So all those ideas of time and temporality have to be thrown out.
And also, one of the things that helped me, and part of the reason why I really started loving, just like, okay, not that I love the Nicaea Creed itself, but I love the fact that the Nicene Fathers were really, really thinking on this hard. They were trying to put wordage, and as limited as they were. But I remember in my church history class, my church history professor brought out to us that one of the prevailing Greek Roman thoughts about the cosmos and about creation was that in their minds, there was only ever going to be one creator, and that's a hard line. It's just an integer. So basically, you can never divide one. And they did not want to ever conceive that there could be anything more than one. And so that's where Arian had his issues with, how can this Jesus be the one when we already know there is the one? And so he was unwilling to let his popular Greco-Roman cosmology be dismantled by essentially like the Hebraic thought of like two powers. Like, we don't care. Like, we're not Greek. We don't have these preconceived notions. So we'll break it. But he was unwilling to let that break.
And then he made Jesus a created being. Yeah.
Yeah, because in some sense, he was unwilling to let his most healthy belief of cosmology be dismantled. And it was a fascinating discussion with my church history professor. I had never heard that before. I never knew that their mentality of cosmology was so fixed that they had these terminologies of emanations, that everything, that you have the uncreated one and everything else that's created was an emanation. And so Jesus was simply the first emanation,
right?
Which violates what the scriptures are saying about who Jesus is. And so,
so better to just stick with the story that the Bible gives on this one, I'd say, and have Jesus coming out of the lap of Yahweh or the Father, which makes no sense, but stay with the beauty of it, the poetry of it. And I love Lewis's essay, Is Theology Poetry? And read it sometime. I think it's available online. His basic point is that as soon as you get into theological language, you are dealing in more than intellect, and you have to feel, think, and function, frankly, as a poet to understand theology. So, well, I think we can land the plane here, Mike, and I'll end with this. Based on last time, this is previous conversation, previous podcast, I recommended 3 points. One, Jesus' deity may not be the crux of John's gospel. So we have to take 1:18 and everything up to it with the importance that it is. What's going to happen in the story of John, the book of John, he's going to come to 21 or 2031 and say, now here's why I wrote the book. I want you to believe he's the Messiah. And so messiahship and deityness are 2 different conversations. Fair enough. But I just want, just to be clear, when it comes to the point of the gospel of this book, it will be to get the reader past the point. Here's the point. Past the point of him being a deity and to the point of him being the Messiah. That's even bigger to John, because we have deities across the map. And, in that world, a deity can show up on your doorstep without fanfare. And we'll see that in the book of Acts. So that's why we have to be careful with that word deity. They didn't have a capital G on God yet. They couldn't do that. So messiahship will be the crux of the gospel, whereas deityness is part of the early shot over the bow. Fair enough. Number 2, a DCW, and here's my point from last time. I said this last podcast. A DCW finds Jesus to be theos with the pre-understanding that multiple theoi exist. So the idea that Jesus can be a theos is not a problem to the DCW mindset, because we already have plural ones. And we have to think, before Aquinas, before even Nicaea, we have to think in terms of the Greek and Hebrew text, in which, again, plural theoi can exist. It's not a problem. And my point then, as I close, is what we don't want to do, and I know you're all about this, Mike, is we can't create a meaning to theos that doesn't exist. We can't put a capital G on God and think we've solved the problem, which almost every book in my library, I pull them off one at a time. I won't go through my frustration with you, now. But when I pull off almost every book, is Jesus God? Is Jesus God? The Christology question. They don't ask the question about theos. They keep saying God, and they keep putting a capital G on it. And I want to say, come on, guys. Like I know, that they didn't have that word back then. So why do you keep appealing to a word? You're not helping the conversation by asking, is Jesus God? We need to get back to the source document, and that is the Greek text of the New Testament, in which he's a unique deity. Fascinating idea. So with that, I'm done. Anything else you want to add before we sign off?
No, I think it was a good conversation. I do love I love the fact that, when we can actually go into the Greek text, and then, it's like right there, it may be a unique moment instead of the unique son, but the unique God. And then we're left with that, what seems to be a theological problem. But it shouldn't be a theological problem.
Oh, boy. Oh, how fun is that? Well, all right. Thank you. And we'll talk next time. Everyone have a wonderful week. And we'll invite you into our next discussion, which will be starting in verse 19.